History as it happens, March 7th, 2024. After Putin.
Joseph Stalin, ruler of a sixth of the earth for 30 years, has been thrown from his pedestal.
This move follows lengthy behind-the-scenes struggles for power, though many thought Khrushchev might seize control.
The death in Moscow of Leonid Brezhnev, 39 days before his 76th birthday, came as no real surprise. He had been very ill for several years.
There is also concern about who will be in charge in the future. And tonight there were long lineups to buy newspapers and hopefully get some information.
Russia's President Vladimir Putin has vowed to crash what he called an armed mutiny in a televised address. It comes after Yevgeny Prigozhin.
Russian authorities are telling Wagner fighters not to follow their leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, and also to take measures to detain him.
Vladimir Putin's been in power for nearly a quarter century. Now 71 years old, he's a modern-day czar who apparently intends to hold on to power for life. But whether Putin rules for another week or another decade, there will come a time when he's gone. Who might replace him is a mystery. Can history be a guide? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
If Putin dies tomorrow, the Prime Minister Mishustin would take his place for 3 months and there would be a new leader who would be elected. That's sort of the legal process. If that is really how it would happen, it's highly doubtful. And the reason is that Putin has really tampered with the constitutional provisions for leadership changes in the past. I mean, he has prolonged the time that he can stay in office now until 2036 and has changed the constitution for that. And perhaps the first sign that he would not just go away was after the presidency of Dmitry Medvedev, when they both basically just swapped places. And it became for the first time very clear for the Russian population that they don't really have a choice.
March 5th, 1953. Joseph Stalin dies. Finally. At 73 years old, he had ruled the Soviet Union through terror and famine for about 30 years. Moviegoers saw the news in newsreels like this one from British Pathé.
His people regarded as a god this man who was born the son of a shoemaker, for above all, he became a star to guide them to a more prosperous way of life. In return, they gave him their undying devotion and accepted his every word as law. But one thing Stalin did not give them, their freedom.
Although it would have been hard for anyone to be as cruel as Stalin, for a time it looked like he might be succeeded by the notorious head of the secret police, Lavrenti Beria, a mass murderer in his own right. But about 2 years later, Nikita Khrushchev prevailed in the power struggle over Beria, who had been executed, and Georgy Malenkov, who resigned as prime minister in February 1955. And please excuse my Russian pronunciation.
Then Stalin died early in 1953, and the world wondered who he had chosen to succeed him. We quickly learned that one of his right-hand men, Malenkov, was now the boss. A few days ago, the Supreme Soviet met, and the chairman read a letter from Malenkov. It stated, after vague references to his inefficient managing of agriculture, that he had resigned. This move follows lengthy behind-the-scenes struggles for power, though many thought Khrushchev might seize control.
This is what Liana Fix and Maria Snegovaya call the retrenchment scenario. A less militant yet still autocratic leader comes to power and pursues a Putinism without Putin approach. They authored a paper for the Center for Preventive Action at the Council on Foreign Relations about the possibility of a leadership change in Russia. I'll share a link to their paper in my weekly newsletter, and you can sign up at historyasithappens.com. They write of the retrenchment scenario. The Khrushchev-type successor would prioritize economic recovery as well as domestic stability over confrontation with the United States and NATO, comparable to the initial phases of Soviet leader Khrushchev's rule, which lasted from 1953 to 64. Having come to power after Joseph Stalin's death, Khrushchev pursued modest economic reform and, to this end, toned down escalation with the West at the beginning of his term. If the war against Ukraine is still ongoing in a retrenchment scenario, a Khrushchev-type successor to Putin would be open to compromise in return for economic benefits, but would be unlikely to pull back Russian forces entirely, as he would not fundamentally change Russia's adversarial relationship with the West, they write. Fix and Snegovaya also outline a radicalization scenario, as when Andropov succeeded Brezhnev in 1982, as well as what they call a fragmentation scenario, where Moscow would lose power over Russia's regions. That is called instability, and it's a scary thing. Whatever the case, predicting when and how Putin might go is next to impossible. Still, the West, meaning the U.S. and its allies, must prepare for it, because Putin ain't going to be around forever. And should the war in Ukraine go badly for Russia, his end may come sooner rather than later. Indeed, Fix and Snegovaya write, leverage for the United States lies in Ukraine, not in Russia. A strategic defeat in Ukraine does not necessarily predicate which of the three leadership change scenarios, radicalization, retrenchment, or fragmentation, will emerge. However, they write, a Russian defeat or multiple military setbacks in Ukraine are the most likely ones to do so. Therefore, they argue a decrease or halt of Western support for Kyiv would not only endanger Ukraine's existence, but also limit possibilities to influence domestic change in Russia and embolden aggressive Russian foreign policy in Europe and beyond. Maria Snegovaya is a political scientist and a senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Liana Fix is a historian and political scientist at Georgetown University and the Council on Foreign Relations. They are experts on Russia and European security, and I'm delighted they're making their debut on the podcast. Hello, Liana Fix.
Thanks so much, and hi.
And Maria Snegovaya, welcome.
Many thanks for having us.
So let's begin with, how does the process of succession work in Russia in reality? Because on paper, there are elections every 4 years. Presumably, if you're running every 4 years, you might lose or not run again and just simply retire on your own. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon when it comes to Mr. Putin. What would happen if, say, Vladimir Putin died tomorrow?
Yeah, so there is indeed a process in the Russian constitution. We talked briefly about this in our paper, that if Putin dies tomorrow, the Prime Minister Mishustin would take his place for 3 months and there would be a new leader who would be elected. That's sort of the legal process. If that is really how it would happen, it's highly doubtful. And the reason is that Putin has really tampered with the constitutional provisions for leadership changes in the past. I mean, he has prolonged the time that he can stay in office now until 2036 and has changed the constitution for that. And perhaps the first sign that he would not just go away was after the presidency of Dmitry Medvedev, when they both basically just swapped places. And it became for the first time very clear for the Russian population that they don't really have a choice, but that it is decided who becomes the new Russian leader. And that is basically still the case today and will be the case in the March elections. It's not a question of who will win. It really is a question of how much effort does the regime have to put into getting the numbers that they want to get. But Maria might want to add more to that.
I will echo Liana by also adding that currently I'm reading a very interesting book by Henry Hale on patronal politics, where I think he really nails down the nature of similar systems in Russia and Eurasia more broadly that are very different also from the Western European counterparts, in that these are very informal links-based systems which tend to all converge in a given polity into some sort of patronal hierarchy with one strong man on top, precisely as we see in Russia these days. They usually tend to hold those hierarchical structures until some shock, say sudden passing of Putin, could potentially be considered such a shock. If that is the case, this is where there will be sudden opening, where we'll see an emergence of competing tiny little strongmen who would try to build their own pyramid by destroying all of the competitors. And eventually one of them will succeed. There's an extent to which formality matters, but the absolute domination in this system is this network, informal networks that really ultimately decide who gets to win.
No system is entirely transparent, not even in democracies. But Maria, that was a very political scientist type way of answering. I guess another way of putting it is, it might be messy. There'd be a power struggle. Russia's having a lot of trouble right now. They're in the middle of a war that's not going all that well for it. So Putin doesn't stay in power simply because he wants to, although he has a large say in the matter. There are elites who have to approve of how things are going in the country, people who have, say, economic privileges thanks to the regime. Who are these people? I mean, I think that's the hard part for someone like me, a distant observer, to understand. The security services, that seems to be one center of elite power.
Yeah, Putin is important because he is on top of this redistribution of the system of patronage, redistribution of spoils. So who are those groups of interests? Well, the conventional wisdom used to look at this as a combination of some sort of more pro-liberal, business-oriented groups and more of the security service, revanchist, national security prioritizing groups. It's clear, though, that after 2020, and especially after the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, security services, the so-called siloviki, have been dominating the system. It's very hard to see one place where all of that is formalized. But we do have, for example, Security Council, which is one of the main decision-making bodies in the country when it comes to domestic and foreign policy-related decisions. And certainly you can see, for example, this particular body tend to have meetings around very important events that end up being very consequential.
So Security Council, that's a formal body. Okay.
It's a formal body, so you can more or less track significance of people depending on whether they make it into the Security Council and also what sort of position they occupy, because there's permanent members and that there are less permanent members, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, Liana, let me add another question to all of that. Would we here in the West be able to see something like this coming if these elites grew unhappy with Vladimir Putin?
I mean, that's a huge challenge to monitor Russian elites and to find the moment when they would actually conspire against Vladimir Putin. And we outlined some warning signals in our paper when this could happen. For instance, economic deprivation of the population in general, who adds pressure on elites. It's all warning signals that are related to the war against Ukraine and related to the economic situation in the country. But what would have to happen is that if one part of the elites considers it is the moment to conspire against Vladimir Putin, they must think that it is less dangerous for them to conspire against Vladimir Putin than to continue the path of what Maria said, this patron-client relationships. So they must feel that their own political or even physical survival is at risk. And I mean, obviously, also the death of Prigozhin has been such a sign that if you conspire, if you lead a mutiny, your own life is at risk. And then those elites would have to bring a part of the security services to their side. And I mean, there's so many competing security services in Moscow that they would need to get a critical mass. Otherwise, one may end up in a situation where different factions, where a coup attempt is not successful, and then you have different factions with different security services loyal to them fighting in Moscow about who keeps power. And for the West and for the outside world, the top tier elites are monitored, like the most prominent people in the regime. But then also, what about the second tier people who can also behind the scenes play a major role in a coup attempt? And how much can you do to monitor those people and to really identify if they are just talking about dissatisfaction or if they have reached the one point where they would actually try to move against it? And that is for Western intelligence a huge challenge, although obviously the United States is investing a lot in this kind of intelligence from Russia. But it is a huge challenge to find this one moment to observe what is unfolding and who is switching sides and who is loyal to whom.
Historically, we don't have a lot of incidents in Russia of elite organized coup. You can probably remember maybe one instance from the Tsarist times, and then there was one under Khrushchev. But in general, Russian elites, just as the Russian society, tend to suffer from the collective action problem. And also, Russian elites are not the same kind of elites as you see in the West. That is one of the reasons why they're less prone to organizing those coups. What I mean is, in the Russian historical tradition and politics, the Tsar, the monarch, the king, the president is one of a kind. And his elites are not his equals or peers. They are his subordinates. They're his employees who are temporarily holding the assets that have been redistributed to him thanks to his favors. Usually they don't have their own independent political capital, and they have a lot to lose if that leader is gone. And this is even more true in case of Putin. Putin deliberately, for the last 24 years, have been atomizing the elites appointing in the position of power people without strong personal connections, without any common background. That way, it makes it much harder for the elites to organize together collectively. Lastly, Nikolai Petrov, an elite scholar from Russia, points out that elites are also horrified because he actually describes the repressions against elites that's been unraveling since mid-2010s as being at massive scale. And this is why they're really horrified. There was a rumor at some point that Russian oligarchs are afraid to get together in more than three because they're just horrified somebody will suspect them of something. So I think that coup at this point is quite unlikely.
This day is coming, if not a coup or something else. I mean, he's not going to live forever. He is in his 70s. Also, Maria, there was a coup under Gorbachev that didn't work.
Attempted coup.
Yeah, attempted coup. Poorly organized. Some of the people who were expected to take part in it were somewhat half-hearted when it came time to make a decision. And obviously, Gorbachev survived that coup, but he was fatally weakened by it and was off the stage within a few months anyway. That was August of 1991. Would you say that it was easier to understand what was happening within the Soviet period because you had a Politburo and you did have the party? The party was the state. Wasn't necessarily efficient or popular at all. You did have formal structures that were running the show. I think, as you mentioned, the Politburo went to Khrushchev and said, "That's it, buddy, you're out of here." And then there was the succession process. Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, Gorbachev. Seemed easier even during the Soviet period to make sense of what was happening.
You can certainly agree with that. I mean, there's no ideology, which is sort of the weakness and at the same time the strength, because Putin can act more arbitrarily than someone who has an ideology and has to follow an ideology. But at the same time, it is also weakness that he does not have this kind of communist ideology that was there in the Soviet Union. On the other hand, in the Soviet Union, even after the death of Stalin and with the coup of Khrushchev, of course, you had these formal systems and institutions, but the power struggles were still taking place behind the scenes, right? So it's not the case that institutions were really the dominant way of how politics worked. You had these institutions, but you had still the power struggles and the informal power struggles behind those institutions and behind the scenes. And there's some good studies about that it's not all about the formal structures and institutions, even in the Soviet Union, and even if a communist system seems to be better structured. And if you look at Vladimir Putin, he had this one attempt of appointing a successor with Medvedev, right? When he tried to place him in power, he was the prime minister, exerting a lot of power also domestically. And from his perspective, this did not succeed. He was not happy with that. He saw that Dmitry Medvedev, he was reaching out to the West with modernization partnerships, but at the same time, from Putin's perspective, he was weak. The war in Georgia started. Russia had kind of victory in Georgia, but a humiliating victory when the military was very weak. So the lesson that Putin learned from that is that it's better that he himself stays at the wheel. And so far, he has not yet appointed any successor or even demonstrated the willingness to open a discussion for that. And by that, he obviously keeps everyone on his or her toes about how the future of Russia will look like.
I was going to ask, why hasn't he named a successor? It's fairly obvious, because he doesn't want to go. He also sees himself as a historical actor now. That's pretty clear. Not that I'm a criminologist over here, but he sees himself as, Maria, fulfilling a historic role of trying to renew Russian greatness.
Absolutely. Can I just quickly jump in? A personal anecdote. When we were working with my co-author, Kirill Petrov, on analyzing the biographical information of the Russian elites, to find out, by the way, that Soviet elite continuity remains extremely pronounced in Russia until now. So many, up to 50-60% of contemporary Russian elites have their backgrounds or family ties in the Soviet ruling class. So much for democratization and elite change. We also discovered another interesting, somewhat paradoxical result in that it gets much harder to find biographical information among more recent, younger Putin elites as compared to the older ones. And that is just a reflection of the system is becoming more closed off. There's more security people with security service backgrounds appointed to positions of power. And accordingly, it becomes just harder to find any information about them. The system is becoming more secretive over time. And one more thing, that this secrecy, unfortunately, is very consequential for the nature of the system. And this is where, Martin, I completely agree with you. Certainly, it was not just easier to track dynamic of the party leadership in the Soviet system, but it was also due to its more institutionalized nature. With all the reservations that Liana made, it was somewhat easier to actually predict the system. We have archives, records of the Politburo discussion of Afghanistan invasion in 1979 when Brezhnev was about to send his troops. And actually, there's a lot of disagreement among the Politburo members. Some are openly objecting to this decision. Compare that to Putin discussing this, quote unquote, discussing this with his Security Council. And we see that all of his people essentially line up to embrace this decision. There was one disagreement on the side of Boris Narishkin, who was subsequently punished. So that is to say that institutionalized systems, they are less dependent on autocrats' discretion. We also know that Putin kept his decision to invade Ukraine secret from broader elite circles. That is why all the way until February 24th, 2022, many of the Russian elites were, ridiculing this idea that Russia was going to invade, not because they were deliberately spreading propaganda, but because they were literally unaware of this decision. Of course, potentially, this system is even more scary and unpredictable than what we had during the Soviet times.
It would seem priority number one, if Putin were to be replaced, would be stability. I mean, in the late Soviet period, it's not clear to me that the Politburo was still interested in reaching stage 4 of Marx's stage theory of history, that they were going to get to communism beyond socialism. They were interested in just holding on to power at that point. And then along came Gorbachev, the reformer, who probably would not have been appointed had the Politburo knew at the time what he had in mind. Maybe even Gorbachev didn't know what he had in mind at the time. I guess what I'm trying to get at here is I'm frightened at the possibility of instability in a change at the top. So why don't we talk about the couple of scenarios you outline in your paper, because they are steeped in history. Liana, we'll start with you. The radicalization scenario where we might have somebody who's even more reactionary, an Andropov-type successor. So who was Yuri Andropov?
Yeah, Yuri Andropov was a Soviet leader who preceded Mikhail Gorbachev, and he was, in his very short term that he was especially at the beginning of the term, he was coming from the what we would call Siloviki background, and he was someone who was more aggressive towards the West at the beginning of his term, and therefore a kind of model for what we call the radicalization scenario, someone who would go for escalation rather than a retrenchment. But we would argue that this kind of radicalization scenario is the source of what you just said, your kind of fear of instability, right? And I mean, this kind of fear of instability that it could get worse, right? I mean, perhaps with Putin, at least we know what we have is something that has been shared in the West and among Western capitals for a really long time, for an incredibly long time. And sometimes you even find it now. And we discussed the scenario and when we presented the radicalization scenario, some reactions would be, oh, well, that would be bad because that person could be even more willing to use nuclear weapons than Vladimir Putin was. But what we want to argue in this paper is that this kind of fear, of course, it's there, but that it can't really get much worse than Vladimir Putin himself. He is the instability. He is the most radical version of Russia that we have seen in a really long time. So our argument is that the United States and the West have to prepare for these scenarios, and we can dive into the others. But this radicalization scenario modeled after Yuri Andropov is not something that should lead us to think, oh, it's better that Putin stays in power and to try to prevent any kind of leadership change. It really is an open question what will happen if leadership change takes place. But this motto of, well, at least with Putin, we know what we have, is not true anymore after February 24, 2022.
Maria, Andropov was the KGB leader, right? I mean, it would make sense to me, of course, I don't know that much about this, that Putin's successor would be similar to him, or at least in background, right? A belief in authoritarian grip on the country, maybe a background in the security services.
It's true, especially looking at the composition of the Security Council, which has a lot of the security service people. Having said that, and I could completely side with Liana, that we should not think of Putin as somebody who we know, because it's clear, I think, from the last 10 years at the very least, that we have a very limited understanding of who Vladimir Putin is. Otherwise, Western policies towards Vladimir Putin, mislead policies of appeasement, trying to negotiate with him, we would not have failed, and it would not have led to even further escalation. Unfortunately, political leaders, the longer they stay in power, they have a tendency to become more radical, especially when they are unconstrained and uncontained. And that's exactly what's happening. With Putin, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's why any rotation, arguably, is actually preferred to no rotation at all. Having said that, we actually do not assign weight probabilities to our scenarios. But I would say, looking at historical record, that even if the next person in power has security links, it's not a given to me that radicalization scenario is the most probable one. I actually would put my money on the retrenchment scenario, Khrushchev-type successor, because historically we do see that after a previous leader gets Russia in some sort of complete mess and escalation with the West, not a lot of people inside of Russia are happy about it. We see the growing spreading fatigue associated to this war in Russia these days. And the elites have to acquiesce, but they're not excited about the fact that they now have to vacation in Dubai instead of Côte d'Azur. The combination of these factors would lead the next leader to try and reset the relationship with the West. So whoever it is, even if that's the person with security and service background, it's likely that certain attempt to negotiate with the West will be made. Most importantly, because the next person does not have so many stakes in this war. For Putin, Martin, as you pointed out, right, he is the great gatherer of the Russian lands, creator of the Russians, or restorer of the Russian civilization, Vladimir the Saint, you name it. And hence, this war is really, really important to him. But for the next leader, it will not be as important, and hence it will be easier to try and end this war. Having said that, this retrenchment scenario, as we point out with Liana, is quite seductive, but also potentially dangerous for the West, because there will be, of course, a temptation on the side of the Western leadership to finally end this mess and, forget about it and refocus, in case of the United States, on China. While, as we say, and it's very important, I think, to keep in mind, that Russia, unfortunately, will still be Russia, whether with Vladimir Putin on top or somebody else on top. And so letting it off the hook after something as horrible as this war in Ukraine, lifting sanctions, resetting the relationship without any serious long-term consequences for Russia, unfortunately opens up a possibility for another escalation in the future. It's very important that the West only allows certain concessions to Russia in exchange to very serious strings attached, and of course also leaving Ukraine for good and also investing in Ukraine's reconstruction. Without that, the odds of something similar repeating in the future, unfortunately, remain very high.
Well, Maria, you brought up the most important variable of all, and I should have brought this up earlier in the conversation, the outcome of the war. Will the war be over when these scenarios play out? Will it be won by either side? Will there be some kind of sustainable negotiated settlement? Khrushchev, Liana, took over after Stalin's chaotic, to say the least, disastrous, murderous rule, although the Soviet Union did emerge from the Second World War victorious. But the country was a wreck, and there was a consolidation of power before Khrushchev became the supreme leader, right? But anyway, back to present day, I guess what I'm getting at here is there are too many unknowns. We just don't know how the war is going to turn out and how that might affect power in Russia.
One argument that we also make, and I think it is important, the West has obviously the most leverage when it comes to Russia's domestic situation through Ukraine. So if the West wants to influence anything about leadership in Russia, this goes through Ukraine. So a defeat for Russia in Ukraine would obviously have most impact on what would happen in Moscow. But at the same time, it is not the case that there's an immediate link between Russia is defeated in Ukraine, and we have a liberal and democratic Russia. I think sometimes this link is made in a more hopeful way than it is actually based in any evidence, right? So just because Russia is defeated in Ukraine will not lead to a westernization or liberalization scenario of Russia, which we didn't even include in our paper because we just thought it is so unlikely. And it is also not clear whether a defeat of Russia in Ukraine will lead to a Khrushchev-type retrenchment, someone who wants to talk to the West, or to a radicalization scenario. So we argue that the kind of leadership change one might see in Russia will obviously interact with what happens in Ukraine, but we should not be naive and hope that a defeat of Russia in Ukraine will automatically lead to a somewhat better regime in Moscow. That is not the case, and we should be prepared for all scenarios. And I mean, the Khrushchev scenario, the retrenchment scenario, I would agree with Maria, is from our perspective more likely. Khrushchev, especially at the beginning of his term, as you said, less towards the end, because this idea of Stalinism without Stalin or Putinism without Putin is something which is quite appealing. And again, the challenge for the West is really how to react to this scenario instead of reacting in the same way as happened with the Putin-Medvedev change, suddenly jumping all on the boat of resets and modernization partnerships with Russia. I think one has to be very careful, even in a Khrushchev scenario, with whom the West will deal in the future.
So, Maria, there's the radicalization scenario, retrenchment, but also fragmentation. We already saw fragmentation in the early 1990s when Russia, with all of its autonomous regions, broke away from the Soviet Union and the empire broke out into its constituent parts. What do you mean by fragmentation this time? You're not talking about Russia, say, breaking up into several smaller countries, are you?
I personally do not think that chances of Russia breaking apart are very high. But there is a possibility, unfortunately, not very visible given the failure of sanctions to really seriously erode Russian economy. But there is a possibility going forward to radical weakening of the federal power, which will end up leading to fragmentation and erosion of Russia's control over its regions. So Russia still remains more or less the same, but there are more domestic tensions, central region disputes, and it's also not the worst possible scenario for neighboring countries, given the fact that historically weaker Russia tends to be more internally looking and less prone to international aggression. So the logic is actually the opposite from what many commentators suggest. Russia does not usually attack international when it's weak, but it tends to be more aggressive international when it's strong and it has a lot of oil revenues. Actually, I've done some research showing a direct correlation between oil revenues and Putin's more escalatory rhetoric against the West.
So you're saying that as far as affecting a positive or best case scenario from a Western point of view in Russia after Putin, it is in the U.S. interest to then keep supporting Ukraine. You make this point in your paper. But are you both concerned that the level of Western support you're calling for will prolong the war unnecessarily or even escalate the war?
I, for my part, don't think that this is a major concern, because what we call for in the paper is, at the moment, unfortunately, the continuation of Western support, right, which stopped with the US Congress not allowing the next aid package to Ukraine, with Europeans stepping in to some extent, but not having the military means to continue the support for Ukraine as it is needed. So what we see right now is that Ukraine cannot hold the line in eastern Ukraine and along the front line because of a lack of ammunition and because of a lack of Western support. So for the moment, it really is the continuation of Western support. And then, of course, we also argue that Western support needs to be strengthened for Ukraine, that Ukraine needs to get, for example, the long-range missiles from Germany. Ukraine needs more air defense systems. Ukraine also needs more coverage of the airspace. That all measures that are part of Ukraine's defense against Russia. It is not something that would escalate. It's not something that would, from our perspective, prolong the war.
But to what end? Sorry to interrupt, Liana, but to what end? At some point, most wars anyway, end with a negotiation. It seems a bad idea to support Ukraine, as Biden said, for as long as it takes, because it'll be Ukraine that is worn out first in a war of attrition with Russia. Supporting Ukraine until Ukraine exhausts Russia doesn't sound like a very good idea.
From my perspective, it does not make the alternative. I mean, the shortest way to end the war would obviously be for Ukraine to capitulate, right? I mean, and to say, well, we accept Russian terms. But that would mean that major parts and large parts of Ukraine would live under a Russian terror regime. And that's what we see in the territories that Russia has already occupied. And the problem right now is, and I'm certainly not against negotiations in principle, but the problem right now is that Russia has not, and Vladimir Putin have not changed their goals. And also, as Maria said, Russia and Vladimir Putin, they feel themselves in a position of strength right now. It is pretty clear from Moscow's perspective that why should they engage in any serious negotiations which would keep Ukraine an independent state and not just a Russian vassal before the US elections in November, when there's a chance that Trump may come in and may just give Ukraine to Russia in some kind of deal. So negotiations is a potential future path for this war to end, but it is a path that has to be taken in a situation where Ukraine is strong enough to take this path so that they don't have to just follow a Russian diktat, and where Russia is not in a position from optimism, but is negotiating in a position from pessimism. And that's unfortunately not where we are right now, also because of the failure of the counteroffensive.
Putin is not fighting a war with Ukraine. I think it's very important for the audiences to understand. Putin is fighting the war with the West. It's very clear in that regard. Pretty much since 2007, he's been fighting this war. And this war, whether we want it or not, will continue as long as Putin is alive, as he in power. It will take different shapes, though. If he's successful in Ukraine, there's a lot of possibilities he can go further. This is increasingly something that Western intel starts reporting, that it's not unlikely that there will be certain provocations against NATO. So make no mistake, this is a long-term war which will not end until Putin is in power. The question is, at which cost will this war be fought by the West? And so my point is, negotiating right now will only give the Kremlin a much-needed break in order to rebuild and push forward. That's exactly what we already observed back in 2014. Had we armed Ukraine back in 2014, maybe the war would have been much less costly for us than it's already now, right? But we actually did not want this war to last in 2014. As a result, it left the Kremlin time to rebuild and attack Ukraine once again for a much more bloody war in 2022. And this vicious pattern will continue. So I actually would suggest that, as horrible as it sounds for Ukraine, it's actually a much cheaper war for the West to fight right now in Ukraine, when the Western boots are not on the ground, right? Essentially, all we are sacrificing is weapons, and much of this money actually stays in the United States, creates new jobs. It's actually good for the US economy. Then having to fight a potentially much more bloody war subsequently when Putin is emboldened enough that he tries to challenge NATO. Also important point is that this war also serves somewhat of a containment for China, ironically as it sounds, because China is a big actor helping right now Russia to fight this war. But China is also watching. If China sees that it's actually okay to just annex other countries' territories without much of international repercussions, China may be more incentivized, obviously, to go after Taiwan. So honestly, unfortunately, we don't have a choice between having a war and not having a war.
But, Ukraine will always be more important to Russia than it is to the United States and maybe Western Europe. I don't see any European countries, maybe in the eastern part of the continent, but on the western side, and certainly no American soldiers. There's no support in the U.S. population to send American soldiers to fight and die for Ukraine's independence. Ukraine will always be next to Russia. Russia will always have a much larger population and a much stronger economy. I'm not trying to sound callous here. I don't like Vladimir Putin, and I want Ukraine to be a sovereign, independent country. But it's about being able to affect realistic outcomes. Is Putin likely to continue on into Moldova or Poland or the Baltic states? I guess we can't rule that out, given what's happened already.
I mean, I would argue that it is obviously a huge challenge, given exactly what you said, the size of Russia's wartime economy. It's much easier for Russia to mobilize and to force people to go to the front. I mean, we've just seen examples that young men who have come to the funeral of Alexei Navalny, or who have come to lay down flowers after he has died, were immediately sent to the front line in Ukraine. I mean, this is something that Ukraine, obviously, this kind of mobilization is something that Ukraine cannot do. But at the same time, we have also seen that the Russian military is quite primitive, right? So with the means that Ukraine has gotten so far, they were able to keep Russia in check. So while it will be difficult to get Russia out of all of Ukraine's territory, Ukraine can hold the line and can hold the line successfully. And the concern, and I would immediately share this with what Maria said, is that if Russia can reconstitute its military, let's say within 5 or 10 years, if that coincides with a situation where NATO is weakened or undermined, depending on the domestic situation in the United States, if those two developments come together, then an attack or a kind of provocation of the Baltic states, of Poland, might look from a Russian perspective much more possible, much more likely, and a doable path, something that Putin would want to go to be in the history books. I mean, this history book thing is really important to him. I mean, if he can be in the history books, not only for regaining Ukraine, but for defeating NATO, basically, and daring to attack NATO, basically ending the catastrophe of what he called the collapse of the Soviet Union and then the Soviet defeat in the Cold War, that would be certainly something that is attractive to someone who is so obsessed with his own role and with the role of history. So it's certainly not a very probable scenario, but it's certainly not something that Western leaders should rule out. And as Maria said, the question is, will this come to us if we have a combination of all worst case factors? Or do we have a chance to keep Russia in check and basically to let Ukraine keep Russia in check with our help, which, as cynical as it sounds, again, is less costly for the West than it is to, at some point, to have to defend yourself against Russia?
This is the war not between just Russia and Ukraine, right? This is a war that's extremely consequential for the international liberal order that as we know it, and the survival of Western liberal democracies. Already in the last year that Russia started this war, we see growing destabilization of the world. There's more and more conflicts multiplying across the globe. Armenia, Azerbaijan, there is Gaza, Israel. There is also recently an escalation between Venezuela and Guyana. And we should probably expect more to come as other wannabe, international autocrats try to challenge the liberal order. With failing to contain Russia right now, we'll end up eroding the sources of the Western might, the liberal international system as we know it, and associated well-being that came with it. And of course, as I said before, this is extremely consequential for the US-China problem. If China is indeed the major geopolitical challenge of the 21st century for the United States, and this is clearly what is written in all of the security doctrines in the United States, we absolutely need to demonstrate to China what it's going to take to invade a different country. As I said, this is not the war between Russia and Ukraine. This is Russia's war with the West, and China, unfortunately, plays an extremely important role helping Russia fight this war. If it wasn't for China's help, Russia would not be as successful in circumventing the Western sanctions.
But Maria, you know that much of the rest of the world doesn't see it that way. They're not necessarily supporting what Russia did in Ukraine, this war of aggression, but when they hear the words rules-based order or liberal international order, they roll their eyes because they see how inconsistently the United States applies those principles itself.
That is true. We actually have a forthcoming article in Foreign Affairs with Mike Kimmich, Max Bergman, and Jeff Mankov discussing what the strategy towards Russia in the long term means with regards to other countries, including the so-called Global South, Martin, that I imagine you're referencing to. Certainly, there's a lot of mistakes that were committed in the Western policy towards these countries. They must be much more actively integrated in the rule-based order, and there's a lot of opportunities for the West that will be also mutually beneficial for these countries. They need to also be explained what benefits they get from the existing system and what potential serious consequences there will be if the system does not survive. And that includes a lot of collaboration, deepening commercial ties, and doing other things that have not been done, therefore leaving a space for Russia and China to fill in. Chinese and Russian presence in the region is also often seen by these countries as being extremely exploitative. And therefore, this actually leaves a lot of opportunities for us. And last but not the least, Russia invests a lot in propaganda, trying to, again, play on these colonial narratives, which is very ironic because Russia is also fighting, obviously, a very colonial war, trying to reinvade its former colony. But that's not how the countries of the Global South see it. I think we can do much more in this domain by pushing our soft power and explaining to these countries what this war really is and why it's important to be on the right side of history.
In upcoming episodes of History as It Happens, it'll be Historians versus Trump, Round 2. Plus, we'll take a look at the career of Benjamin Netanyahu as he wages war in Gaza. Go to historyasithappens.com and sign up for my newsletter to stay on top of everything we're doing here. This is a podcast from the Washington Times.